Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tyler McCann, and I'm the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Our webinar will focus on how we use land in Canada for agriculture and food. It is important to acknowledge that Canada's First Nations were the first stewards of this land. While we will not explore that important relationship, the relationship between First Nations and the land and agriculture during today's dialogue, it is something that we recognize needs greater consideration in the agriculture policy landscape. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining the webinar from Western Quebec, the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. If you've been following CAPI's work over the last year, and almost since it was first created, you probably know that we talk about many of the issues facing Canadian agriculture, but one that continues to come up in our work is the pressures faced by agricultural land. Canada is certainly a big country, but all of that land is deceiving, with only 7% of it suitable for agricultural use. That 7% is increasingly being asked to do more. We want agricultural lands to drive economic growth, improve environmental sustainability, contribute to local and global food security. But that 7% is also under pressure from urban expansion, climate change, and more. Today's dialogue will explore some of these dynamics and the policy approaches being used to try and manage them. We're also pleased to introduce CAPI's new agriculture web mapping application tool this morning. It combines production attributes, agro-environmental indicators, and more to provide a picture of how we use agricultural lands. It also offers advanced capabilities that include assessing conversion risk and prioritization for restoration. The work that we do at CAPI is only possible due to the support of our funders. We are grateful for the support from the RBC Foundation through its RBC Tech for Nature initiative. Please visit our website to find out more about how you too can also support CAPI. Before we dive into the policy dialogue, we want to start with an overview of the mapping tool. I welcome Matt Carlson from ALCES, who led the team that built and developed the mapping tool, to provide an overview and a demonstration of what the tool can do for us. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Tyler. It's my pleasure to be with you all today to show this new tool that we're quite excited about in that it harnesses cutting-edge web mapping technology to achieve the important objective of improving the accessibility of information about agricultural land use in Canada. The tool is publicly available online thanks to the support of CAPI and its sponsors, which is great. And I'll start by showing the data sets that are behind the tool. The data sets are national in scope and focused on really three topics. One is land cover in the agricultural region. So there's two data sets, the AASC semi-decadal land use data set and the annual crop inventory. There's also information on management practices through the Census of Agriculture, the number of layers within that data set on agricultural inputs and tillage practices. And there's also information on the status of the environment through a set of agri-environmental indicators that look at values such as emissions, water quality, ecosystem carbon, and wildlife habitat. And the tool is designed to be very flexible. And one way that it does that is by allowing the user to create custom maps for a wide range of study areas. So, for example, there's provinces. You can create maps for agricultural regions, of which there are about 5 to 10 in each province, and also more detailed census subdivisions, which are counties, of which there are thousands across the country. Let's start at the national scale, which is the default, and look at one of the land cover layers, the AASC semi-decadal land use data set. So the data set here we can see has national extent. There's a legend that allows the user to interpret the colors on the map. This is showing different types of land cover across the Canadian provinces. And there's a graph that shows the area of each land cover type in the country. And if you zoom in, it's possible to see that this is actually quite a detailed data set, about 30-meter resolution. And for example, zooming into this area, we can see the mixed land cover, which defines much of the agricultural portion of Canada. So we're seeing wetlands, water, grassland, built-up areas such as roads, and of course, cropland in this area. I think I zoomed into southern Saskatchewan. Now, the legend is interactive, which allows the user to focus in on individual types of land cover, such as cropland. So now we're looking at the distribution of cropland across the country, and the graph focuses in on the aerial extent of cropland. So we can see that there's about 480,000 square kilometers of cropland, but then has declined by about 2,000 square kilometers over the 20-year extent of this data set. And the maps are dynamic in that the user can move through time to explore temporal change. As I mentioned, you can select custom study area. So as an example, let's go to Western Ontario. Bear with me for one moment here. I'll select the Western Ontario agricultural region. The map now is clipped to the extent of that region. And it's easy to then again select that same land use data set. And now both the map and the statistics are for this one study area as opposed to the whole country. And focusing in on cropland, we can see that cropland declined in this portion of the country. And if we turn on built-up areas, we can see that the reason for that decline is a growth in built-up areas. For example, expansion of settlements such as Mississauga, Guelph, and Kitchener. And toggling back and forth, you can see that the expansion, the conversion. Now, one thing that becomes quite apparent when you use this tool is that patterns in agricultural land use are not uniform across the country, but there's a lot of differences. So, for example, looking at northwestern Alberta, the Mackenzie County, we can see that cropland there has actually increased through time by about 300 square kilometers. Now let's move on and look at land use practices or management practices, one of which is no tillage, a practice that can reduce erosion risk and increase soil organic carbon. Looking at no tillage across the country, in this map, the darker the blue shows higher adoption of no tillage. This is a 0 to 1 scale where 1 means 100% adoption. We can see that Alberta and Saskatchewan have high adoption of no tillage, and that at a national scale, adoption has increased from about 30% to 50%. Now let's zoom into one portion of the country. This is Agricultural Region 3 in southern Saskatchewan. And it's an area where there's high adoption. No tillage has increased from about 75% to about 85% over the past 10 years. And one aspect of this mapping tool, which gives it a lot of power, is the ability to ask more detailed questions using a query builder where we combine data sets. For example, we can ask the tool to map cropland in areas where the adoption of no-till agriculture is greater than a threshold, let's try 80%. We apply that query. The model's thinking here. And we can see now that the adoption of no tillage has increased over time in this area, which has increased the area of cropland, so above that 80% threshold. That's just one example of the types of questions that can be asked using the query builder, which allows users to combine data sets. As I mentioned earlier, there's also environmental indicators in the tool. So for example, here, looking at one of the agri-environmental indicators, soil organic carbon change. So a lighter color in the map indicators an increase in soil organic carbon, which is good from a greenhouse gas mitigation perspective. A darker color indicates decrease in soil organic carbon, which is not desirable. Over time, we can see that this region has shifted towards increasing soil organic carbon, which is a good thing. And it's interesting that this has occurred in an area where there is adoption of no-tillage agriculture. Now, agri-environmental indicators have different patterns depending on which indicator you look at. So for example, let's look at wildlife habitat. Again, the lighter the color indicates more favorable outcomes, so high habitat capacity for wildlife. Darker color shows a low capacity, so less desirable. We can see that there's been very little change in a habitat capacity over the past decade or two, with it staying at about a moderate level, but there's lots of differentiation in the pattern within this southern Saskatchewan agricultural region. And this gives an opportunity to demonstrate another aspect of the tool that allows the user to explore patterns, and that is through having multiple data sets open and toggling between them. So we can see by toggling between the wildlife habitat layer and the land cover layer that the wildlife habitat capacity is higher in areas, so the lighter the color, in areas where there is natural land cover is more abundant, just emphasizing the importance of retaining natural land cover within the agricultural landscape. I think I'll leave it there because I want to give ample opportunity for the panelists to talk. But thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Matt. And we appreciate that some questions that have already come in. And Matt, rather than getting into them now, maybe you can take the opportunity to respond to some of them through the chat system. Would like to let everyone know that, again, this is just a really initial snapshot as to all of that this tool can do. We will, on January 24th, host an interactive information session to dive deeper into the tool and what it can do. There is space limited. We do encourage you to register. A link will be shared in the chat today, and please take the opportunity to really, if you want to roll up your sleeves and understand what the tool is. But now we'd like to get into the panel discussion. Land use is often the elephant in the room when we talk about agriculture policy in this country, and we're pleased to have three panelists join us today. And we really want to start by setting the stage around what land use means to them and the work that they do. So I'd like to introduce our panelist. Dr. Ronnie Drever is a senior conservation scientist at Nature United. He led the publication of a large collaborative study that was the first comprehensive assessment of nature-based mitigation of climate change in Canada. Susie Miller is the executive director at the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, an organization that facilitates cross-commodity collaboration on sustainable agriculture issues and opportunities facing grain sector participants. Susie has more than 30 years experience with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the Government of Saskatchewan, and industry associations. And finally, Dr. Bronwyn Wilton is the principal and lead consultant at Wilton Consulting Group. She has extensive experience with engagement and collaboration in the agri-food industry, rural studies, and rural planning. So I'd like to thank all three of them today. And Susie, I'd like to kick things off with you and really ask a simple question. How does land use intersect with the work that you do every day?
Thank you, Tyler, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this very interesting panel. I there are a lot of ways in which land use intersects, but I'd like to focus on the marketing aspects. For some markets, such as biofuels, and for some jurisdictions, such as the EU, there are strict requirements on particularly the conversion of land from forest or other natural areas for crops that are grown on that. And that is a potential market limiting aspect. It's not for the majority of the crops, but it is becoming more and more of a trend.
And Susie, I think often we think about deforestation, these issues with the EU as an issue for palm oil or an issue in other parts of the world. Can you shed a little bit more light around what it actually means and how it's an issue either for kind of individual farmers that are feeding into the value chain or the value chain itself?
Well, I think it has an impact both on an individual farm level and an aggregate. The individual farm level, to participate in some of the markets, such as biofuels into the EU, a farmer has to certify that the land that is grown, on which the canola is grown, for example, was not, for example, forest land after 2005. On an aggregate level, about 3 years ago, I got a phone call from one of our members to say that their clients in the EU were not going to purchase Canadian feedstuffs anymore because we were in danger of deforestation. It's pretty counterintuitive for us, but they were using data that showed that there had been some forest loss and that agriculture was one of the contributing factors. I was able to provide data that showed that our cropland has in fact not increased over time, and that deforestation could have been from relocation of cropland that was purchased for and used for other purposes.
And just finally, how, I mean, we like to talk about data informed or evidence informed policy making. How often are you using relying on land use data in the work that you do?
Quite frequently, but I think the most important part of it is to understand the context. And our context is different. And what's exciting about this tool is that it includes all sorts of land. So there's information on the agriculture use, but the land within the agriculture use. There's a tendency to focus on land that is farmed, but there's a lot of land on farms that has other uses, either mixed uses like sort of livestock and crops, or nature-based land. And I think that bears quite a bit more exploring in the future.
Great, great, thank you, Susie. And so Bronwyn, we'll come to you next, and you approach this as someone that's got a career working on issues around rural planning, but also now as a counselor in a community in Ontario. Can you share how your work engages and intersects with land use planning and land use change issues?
Sure. Thanks, Tyler. And actually, after Matt's presentation of the tool, it brings me back to when I used to teach a course called Resource Planning Techniques at the University of Guelph. And now I just wanted to spend the whole hour playing around with the tool. So thank you, Matt. It looks pretty impressive, the work that's gone into that. So I look forward to learning more. But yeah, so in our work with Wilton Consulting Group, we do a lot of work with either farm organizations or municipalities and looking at agriculture and agri-food sector systems. And so land use always comes up as one of the key foundations in terms of what that agri-food system can look like if the land is under threat, for example, from urban conversion to urban uses and what that means for the stability of the agriculture and agri-food system, and also from a local and regional food system perspective. And I think often we think of local food systems as being small scale and things like that. But when we think about the big Ontario GTA municipalities, that food system involves like food processing at a very significant level that's providing baked goods, food and beverage products, you name it, into significant brands across the country. So I think we need to think about our regional food systems as relying on that foundational aspect of the land itself. So that's from our professional side, how we're using it. Always comes up. I was just mentioning we did a focus group last night for a big GTA municipality, and the land use was the topic that everybody was concerned about and wanted to talk about from a policy perspective, and making sure it was protected for future uses, and thinking of those kind of that supply chain and value chain perspective there. And also from succession. So allowing young farmers to enter into the market from that perspective too.
And certainly, Bronwyn, I think most people that are with us today would be aware of some of the political policy controversy that's kind of unfolded in Ontario in particular over the last year, I suppose, really.
Yep.
But those issues are very similar across the country, where we have this pressure around land use policies and how do we find that balance, that protection. What's your sense today of how much of an understanding we have around what that policy landscape looks like and how well it's actually working protecting agricultural lands?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think even from the 1970s, when we first had the food land guidelines in Ontario, and a lot of the focus then was on protecting the Niagara and the tenderfruit region in Ontario, which is a very unique growing area. And that it changes over the years in terms of every time a provincial government changes, there is the provincial policy statement which is on land use more generally, but includes what happens to agricultural land, shifts in one way or another, for better or for worse, depending on your perspective. And so currently we have policies that have been undergoing a lot of change over the last couple of years, and there's quite a bit of uncertainty where it's going to land in terms of agricultural protection. And I think one impact it's had is that the public is very much aware now that the policies at the provincial level really matter. And so from my hat with the a municipal councillor, those policies at the provincial level really influence what a local municipality can do or not do in terms of protecting agricultural land. And so I think that's an important thing that needs to be part of the public conversation around what our food land and our, not just food, but food, fiber, and fuel lands can, where it should fit in terms of policy statements, and also in relation to other uses. So right now we've seen some examples in Ontario where energy, for example, often trumps agricultural land, and also industry. So we had an example recently of a large EV plant. I won't say which company, but one big company coming in. It's seen as a big success, a coup for Ontario and for Canada to bring one of these big international companies into the area. But they're taking approximately 2,000 acres out of prime farmland production. So what does that mean for that local regional economic system around food and agriculture in that area? And then also for the province as a whole, if we're seeing that food lands and agricultural lands can just be kind of trumped by other uses depending on the situation. So it's definitely a concern in Ontario for sure.
Great, and we'll get into some of those pressures. Again, I think that's a really great snapshot on a really stark pressure that exists, especially in areas around urban Canada. But before we go there, Ronnie, you work for Nature United, bring a kind of a career in conservation space, but some was talked about earlier about kind of our evolving awareness and understanding. I'm curious if you could again shed some light around what does land use look like to you in your day-to-day work, and maybe touch at how some of that's changed over time.
Sure. Well, thanks, Tyler, for the opportunity to be here today. It's my pleasure to speak to you today from the Algonquin Anishinaabe territory in Western Quebec. So I'm in my day job, as you mentioned, Tyler, I'm a senior conservation scientist, and with a specific focus on biogeography. And so land use and land use change are absolutely central to why I get up in the morning. And so understanding and mapping the rates and types of changes that we see in our land base in Canada is just absolutely central to my interests. And they're absolutely central to understanding the sustainability of our agricultural systems. And it's absolutely central to understanding what it means for the conservation of biological diversity in Canada and all those targets and goals that we have as a society to make sure that those values are maintained. The other main part that I like to focus on in terms of land use and land use change is on relationships. I think it's really central that we have relationships and are very mindful of the relationship between the land owner, the land user, the land steward, and the land itself. And because I think often those links, those relationships are frayed or fractured. And so to the extent that we can regain them, build them, and build those ancient connections that are there, I think we'll be better for it. Yeah, so the understanding, sustaining, building those relationships is absolutely central to my vision of how we should move forward with land use change in Canada.
And Ronnie, it's a good segue to talking about some of the tensions and pressures that exist, because those relationships are under pressure, and I think it's, you know, it can be a challenging to talk about all of these different demands that we're looking for out of land and what that means for the people that are involved. Again, we do want to improve the sustainability. Land use is incredibly important, but those land stewards, those landowners are under a lot of different pressure that drives some of that change. What do you see is how those tensions, those pressures can be managed, and how you can better support the relationships between landowners, land stewards?
Well, good question. I mean, I'm a scientist, so better information is always a key to, I think, better decisions about stewardship and conservation of biodiversity. The tensions are many and they're changing all the time. And as you mentioned in the introduction, there's a lot of pressure that we're putting on our lands, and the types of pressures are themselves being responsive to all kinds of influences, both at the local level in terms of the types of the example that Brian brought up earlier is such a brilliant illustration of the tensions that we face. You know, we want to build an EV plant to help our transition our transportation system, but at the same time, is that going to come at the cost of our ability to produce local food? And so those are the types of decisions so we need to be really mindful at the kind of implementation project scale and the context and scale, as Susie mentioned earlier, that are central to understanding what is the right thing to do in any context. And so, so obviously, as someone who cares daily about climate change and understanding how the agricultural sector can continue to improve on how it's doing is I think a great opportunity. And we saw that, for instance, in the wholesale transition, the map showed the maps of from very little no-till in Western Canada to almost 80% in certain jurisdictions. So what happened there, and how can we replicate that with other aspects of the regenerative agricultural system? I think is a really important way to think about how we should act in the future.
And Susie, that is one of the interesting tensions I think that exists around kind of the sustainability question as a whole, where farmers do point to that significant change that has been made over the last 20 years around no-till and more sustainable cropping systems, that boost to soil organic carbon that Matt pointed to earlier. But also, again, this pressure to do more, again, at the same time, when you look at deforestation and land use change, that has been a sensitive issue. Some of the work that the Roundtable's done with some of its members and growers over the last couple of years has really identified land use and kind of that tension, that balance between an individual's decisions that they need to make on their own farm versus these kind of broader goals. How do those tensions, pressures get managed along the value chain today, and how are they balanced approach?
Well, one of the issues is not they're not being handled, and it's left, each individual land manager makes their decision based on the costs and benefits. And one of the things we did at the CRSC was, I believe it was 2019, we had a literature review conducted on the benefits to farmers of on-farm biodiversity. So what we were talking about, what impacts does it actually have on the production system? Because there's anecdotal information, some positive, some negative in terms of water retention, et cetera, et cetera. We couldn't find any results that were applicable to the crop sector in Canada. And there are a lot of results about the benefits to the public in terms of ecosystem services, but not in terms of the farm operations. So there's no data to be able to incorporate into the business land decision. And as many farmers quote to me, they're not making any more land. And so farmers have been basically intensifying the use of their land. And sometimes that intensification means the removal of land which is being used with natural or semi-natural habitats. And sometimes it means also changing from pasture or native grasslands into croplands. There are wonderful programs like Alice, for example, the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited. But anecdotally, they tend to appeal to those who were going to preserve or restore anyway, and certainly are not of a value level to counteract the intense market pressures, whether it's to reduce production costs, increase revenue, or in times of succession to actually convert the land. So there's a lot of work that can be done. There are good models out there to work with, but I believe we're at the beginning stages of integrating the EG&S considerations in the use of farmed land and non-farmed land on farms.
Right. And Susie, that often,
Tyler?
go ahead, Bronwyn.
Yeah, if I could add to that, just 'cause I think those are great points. But the other tension I see is some of these programs that are wonderful, and even government programs, public programs aimed at helping farmers implement best management practices to protect water quality or increase soil organic matter or any of sequester carbon, any of those types of best management practices that we see. And there's so much work goes into that. And then in a place like Southern Ontario, there's that risk that all that work is going to be undone when the land is converted to urban uses. So I think that's an interesting conversation, and sometimes something that causes a little tension in terms of we've put all this effort into these lands on these farms. Even at a hyper local level in my municipality, I drive by a farm that's done a beautiful job of rehabilitating a stream. They've got some set aside for some forested land, and then very productive agricultural land. It's Class 1 agricultural land. I know it's slated for urban development, so I just dread the day when all of those things are kind of ripped up and churned over, and just think of all the effort that's gone to that at multiple levels of government to create those programs and by the individual farm managers themselves. So I always find that an interesting kind of juxtaposition of what happens on the landscape as well.
And Bronwyn, I think that there's one of the tensions. I think agriculture typically likes to talk about the impacts of the loss of ag land to urban expansion. I think that that's the land use conversion that people get more excited about. But there is kind of this other end of the spectrum as well, where we've got agriculture itself that is taking some of that, what maybe in the past was that non-farmed farmland that Susie was talking about, bringing it into production, or taking again land that was in long-term pasture or natural habitat and putting it into crop production. you know, you've done some work again on the Canadian Agri-Food Sustainability Initiative and looking at kind of what sustainability means on farms and how those pressures play out. Again, we've got two ends of the spectrum. How do you see that kind of pressure playing out and how we reconcile kind of these two different stories of land use and land use change in agriculture?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a important things to think about. Just as I mentioned, those best management practices is really key to understanding how farmers can kind of translate what they're doing on the farm level up into those sustainability programs that Susie's mentioned earlier. So if there is a woodlot or hedgerows and things like that, how are we talking about that from a farm practices at the farm level through to those kind of sustainability schemes and standards? So yeah, we did see, I think people in Ontario will understand what I mean when they saw some hedgerows being removed, commodity prices go up, you can get a lot more money per acre for different commodities. So why won't we farm right to the edge of the margins? And is there data to say that that's not a good thing? Susie, I think, has a good handle on that and saying it's difficult from a financial perspective to make the case to leave the hedgerow when you get X amount per acre in terms of revenue if you farm it. So those conversations are also really critical and I think tricky to, I'm not sure we have the data to really explain that. And I think hopefully some of the mapping tool might provide some of that information, or maybe Susie could add some details to that. But yeah, I think that's an ongoing conversation. If we spend the time getting best management practices implemented, how do you maintain them and make sure they're sustainable over the long term? And are they helping the farmer with their financial goals as well?
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
go ahead, Ronnie.
I just kind of, one of the things that this conversation is highlighting
Mhm.
now is another tension between sort of the short term and the long term. You know, one of the things, you know, we want our farms and our agricultural lands to deliver towards our long-term goals of nature conservation, climate change, mitigation. But farmers are under short-term pressures to deliver on, you know, bank loans and all these other things that are part of their day-to-day lives. And so that tension between the need to deliver on these short-term outcomes are typically socioeconomic, with these sort of long-term outcomes are typically more in the public good space. Can we develop tools or approaches or bridging mechanisms that allow the sort of right behavior in the short term that'll translate to those long-term goals, and do that short-term behavioral change in ways that benefit the farmer, either by making her life easier, having more money in the bank, or more grain in the bin. And so that's one of the key tensions that I see, sort of the short term versus the long term.
And Susie, if you want to come into this and maybe start to look at, so what does the future look like when it comes to land use policy and the approaches that we have in place here?
What does the future look like, or what would I like to see the future look like?
Well, again, maybe that's one of the good tensions that's there around kind of how do we think it should be versus what's likely to actually happen.
Well, when I talk to farmers, the focus of land use and agriculture land use as either as a problem tends to be counterintuitive, in the sense that they don't physically see a reduction in wildlife. And in fact, there's more deer, there's more, depending on the species. I mean, there's coyotes in my backyard in southern Ottawa, South Ottawa. And so they have expressed to me that they feel that there's not an understanding of how they farm and the contribution that they already make, and that farming and nature are actually coexistent. And so a future to me would mean better common understanding between those who are advocating for nature-based solutions and those that actually are going to be responsible for implementing them on farm. And part of that discussion is, where is the problem? where are the solutions? And you know, Ronnie has mentioned no-till. Well, that came about because it made sense. It made sense from an economic perspective, from a soil health perspective, from a productivity perspective. It's not intuitive yet that nature-based solutions on farm. I talked about that literature review that we did that didn't show any, just because there's probably benefits there, but it just hasn't been the focus of research. So how do we put together this socioeconomic analysis that will let us see clearly, more clearly, the solutions and an integration across the way that we think? That includes public lands, includes private lands, and gives the credit to the farmers where credit is due. That's the big start.
And Ronnie, I'm curious as to your experience. I mean, one of the challenges I talked earlier about evidence, this desire for evidence-based policymaking. I had someone in government say that it's better to refer to evidence informed, because the evidence can only get you so far, and it usually doesn't tell you actually what the best policy decision is at the end of the day. But what's your sense as to kind of where we're going around our understanding of what land use looks like? What does the science tell us versus all of the other, again, socioeconomic pressures that are here that governments must grapple with as they try to develop the right policy frameworks?
Yeah, well, again, good question, Tyler. I guess I think there's a lot of room for better evidence, absolutely. And but the question becomes about who has the evidence and how it gets used. So for instance, coming back to the no-till example, I was speaking with my colleague, Dr. Les Fuller, about this stuff, and he was mentioning that part of the reason, or one of the driving forces behind that change in behavior at the farm level, was not because scientists said, oh, you should try this approach. It was because Canada at that point had a very robust system of demonstration farms, and farmers will listen to each other and their neighbors. And so there was a really robust, a set of evidence about the benefits to the bottom line and to soil erosion and to productivity and yields, because of the implementation of this practice that was done in a very kind of public, showy way. And then farmers were able to see that in practice, see their neighbors benefiting from that practices, and embrace that practice themselves because of this sort of improvement in the triple bottom line that they saw. So absolutely, we need more academic research, more science-based research for that. I mean, I say that as a scientist, but I think what we also really need is all of the extension that is necessary to translate that into practical terms, into real world examples that people can use and guide their own behavior. And unfortunately, I think one of the things that, in terms of where we should need to go and in the future we'd like to see, I think we do need a better system of extension in Canada. We used to have a reasonably good one, and it's sort of been chipped away over the decades. And so bringing that back as a way of, making the link between new knowledge and its application just to more tightly coupled, and that I think that will help translate new knowledge and evidence into actual on the ground change.
Ronnie, just on extension, I always think it's odd that it seems like extension and more support for extension is something that is broadly supported, yet gets very little traction at the end of the day. That's an odd kind of tension that I think that exists. But Bronwyn, you talked about your work as on a municipal as a municipal councillor. I think one of the issues that we have again here is that we've got that kind of the municipal, provincial, federal jurisdictions that make the policy landscape challenging. And so we've got the federal government right now moving forward with a sustainable ag strategy that is largely silent on land use, in part because it's not a federal jurisdiction issue. But it's hard for me to imagine that we're going to have a strategic approach to sustainable agriculture systems without giving due consideration and thought to land use and how it plays out. Bronwyn, how do we try and reconcile that difference between what's the responsibility of a municipality, a province, a federal government, let alone a couple 100,000 farmers and private landowners across the country? you could figure
Yeah.
that out for us, that'd be great.
Yeah, no problem. No, just kidding. No, that is the challenging question for sure. And I think what's missing in Canada is that national dialogue about agricultural land use. So we started to do that with the Canadian Land Inventory, and over the years, there's been different kind of attempts to understand what our national agricultural land position is. But I think right now there's so much caution at the federal government level to not step on the province's toes when it comes to the jurisdiction of land use as a provincial responsibility, that it's kind of seen as hands off from that conversation. So you end up with provinces being able to manage that themselves, which seems okay on the surface. But then if you start thinking about Canada as a nation having that rich agricultural land base to work from, and if we all had a common understanding that the agricultural land base should be protected in the similar ways as we protect our freshwater resources and our minerals and our aggregate resources, then that would be, I think, would change the conversation right down to the municipalities. So I really do think would be valuable for a federal government to kind of tackle that conversation, and whether that happens through something like what Senator Rob Black is doing with his soil study right now, and maybe an add-on to that, or maybe it happens in Parliament, I'm not sure, but it would be a challenge. I'm not saying it's going to be an easy task, but I think to at least have that dialogue, because if we see a province where we're starting to treat agricultural land as vacant land, waiting for some other use that seems higher and better from policymakers' perspective, then I think we run the risk of losing agricultural capacity at a national level on a province by province basis, which could be detrimental to our position as an exporting country and our regional economic agri-food systems as well. So,
And Susie, I'd like your thoughts on this, and maybe to respond to one of the questions that's come in around effectively, if what are the policy options that are actually available in this space? And you know, the comment is that extension nudges payments don't seem to be moving the needle. Do we have a regulatory deficit? Worth noting that because there is a provincial lead, we do have different policy landscapes, regulatory landscapes across the country that allow us to see whether or not different approaches have different outcomes. But how do you kind of see this jurisdictional issue, and how do we approach that?
Well, if you take a look at where the provincial land use agriculture policy has come in, the first driver and the one that is most consistent across the country is the right to farm. And so that there is legislation in each province that permits the farming without the threat of, you know, sort of interventions by those that may live in the area. Like, for example, a noise and nuisance is generally accepted. So that's rather interesting that farming as a activity is protected. Farmland is not necessarily. But yet more provinces have jurisdiction, like British Columbia has quite strong and has for a long time, and Ontario, Quebec, PEI, for example, but the other provinces have never seen any need to protect farmland in a grosso modo way. But when it comes to what farmers do on their land, it's really been only Quebec that has, and to a certain extent Prince Edward Island, who have taken a very assertive approach. For the others, it's hands off. And the tension there, and at the municipal level, particularly if you go out into the prairies, in Saskatchewan, there's over 600 municipalities. And the ones who run the municipalities are the ones who live there, and those ones are farmers. And so there is a great reluctance by provincial governments that I have seen to, when there isn't a defined problem, to impose a solution. And when there is no benefit that can be determined in an economic sense, and you know, there are lands that are protected, and there's still some, you know, farming done. Saskatchewan, for example, has great tracts of all of the PFRA pastures, or most of them, were on provincial crown land, and they are well protected and they are used for grazing, etc. But it's a very, very tough political issue. It's like somebody coming in. This is how I've been told. It's like somebody coming into your house and telling you that you can only have 3 electrical lights
Right.
on, or 3 appliances.
But Susie, you talked about kind of this dynamic around when there's no defined problem, governments are reluctant to impose a solution. But is one of the issues here actually not that we don't have an absence of a defined problem, but actually kind of a multitude of defined problems with competing interests and competing solutions at the end of the day?
Well, I wouldn't say that they're problems, and governments tend to tackle problems, and legislation is only when they're really, pushed hard, because legislation is expensive, both politically and from a government perspective. But it is competing objectives. And I think that's where the tension is, and what we have been talking about all along. Government has competing objectives, and that's one of the challenges to work with farmers. They say, well, where is food security in all of this? I produce food to feed the world, and there would be starving people in Africa if I didn't produce my wheat. And so the land use, or how would I put it? The way that a farmer uses the land tends to be a low priority in terms of objectives, from from what I've seen at a provincial government perspective, with notable exceptions. And Prince Edward Island, for example, that exception came because there were significant environmental issues.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah.
Right. Yeah, if I can jump in there, because I would be remiss coming from Ontario if I didn't talk about the competing tension between housing and land use. So housing is definitely an issue across the country, but Ontario is feeling it very sharply, and I know other provinces are as well. So there tends to become a conversation where housing beats everything. So there's this kind of storyline that we have to do these land conversions because we need the housing. And what's missing from that conversation is the flip side on the policy, in terms of what does housing look like in Canada, and do we all still have to follow this kind of dream of having our own single family house with a yard and everything, which we know is not happening in GTA anymore with the intensification of housing. But so I think there's intensification of agricultural production on what we have of ag land, but we also have to think of how we live in our urban areas as well. And I know in the urban areas, having that conversation about, does agriculture fit into the urban areas as well, in terms of different types of vertical agriculture, urban agriculture, or urban gardens, and other types of innovative ways to look at that. So we do I think Ontario's I know I'm speaking from an Ontario perspective, but it is in a pretty kind of, all of the people want to live where all of the best land is in Ontario. So that's a big challenge across the province, and just reconciling that is going to be an ongoing challenge for sure. And that plays out at the provincial level and right through all the municipalities as well.
And then when you use less preferred agricultural land, for example, taking land that was farmed in the 1800s, early 1900s, that has been left grow wild, and then you convert that back, there are market and societal risks attached to doing that.
Exactly.
So that's another tension, in terms of being able to replace that land that is being used for other purposes. That's a no-no.
Yes.
Internationally, it's considered bad form, and it could have consequences for Canada's reputation. It just doesn't make sense in a lot of ways.
But
And I think maybe this is where the tool that Tyler and Matt and your team are developing has a role to play. I mean, I think you know, there is better living to be achieved through land use planning. You know, the sort of transparent, publicly accessible system of land use monitoring and change, I think has a lot of potential uses in addressing these tensions. So you know, if we understand where our best agricultural land is, that, you know, and everyone does, then there will be this sort of wave of pressure, if you will, in theory, against the development of that land for public housing and maintaining of that land for local food production. And the inverse is true. You know, maybe we should be thinking about lands that are low productivity, low soils, poor soils, as places where we think, you know, we should be thinking about new homes.
So I want to pick up on a comment and a question that came in as my last question to you all. The question starts, this isn't new, right? And this is one of the realities with land. I mean, these issues have been playing out in different ways for a long time. Do you think that things are going to change, or will it be, going back to kind of Susie's comment earlier, you know, can we expect our approach to land use from an ag perspective to change dramatically, or do you think that that policy framework approach that's baked in today is likely to continue to remain for the foreseeable future? Susie, your thoughts on that?
I think it has to change. I think we're being forced from a market perspective to change. And it's the question is to how to do it. And challenges, extraordinary challenges mean extraordinary solutions. And we're not really serious yet. We're tinkering around the edges of those things that we know will work. But when, and I don't want to use an outdated 90s term, paradigm shift, but in essence, that's what we're talking about, including who we talk to, who we work with, how to get this common understanding and common appreciation that leads to a solution that works for at least most.
Ronnie, do you see change coming?
Well, change is coming. Whether or not it's the change we want is a different question. But I actually have it might be much my personality, but I have quite a lot of hope actually for this. I think there's Canada is a place where we could see the types of transitions and paradigm changes that are necessary. We have, I think, still quite a good system of governance and regulations and oversight, and the Canadian public is still very respectful of the rule of law. There's new attention played on these issues that really weren't there in the past. We have a farmer community that has a track record of positive change, as we've seen with the no-till example and the stoppage of broadcast burning and that kind of stuff. And then I think what wasn't there in the 90s that is there now are these new tools. You know, remote sensing, and especially if it's done in a publicly available, transparent way with good metadata and all this stuff, has the potential to give anybody a clear understanding of the scale and context of their place and the role that they can play in terms of moving society along in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you. And Bronwyn, last response to you. What change do you see coming?
Yeah, I see the same, like it has to change. And I do see the important role of municipalities. One large regional municipality near Toronto that I've been working with, they really started to see the impact of the ag sector from that economic perspective, and seeing how all those pieces come together as one big kind of interconnecting puzzle. They need to protect their land base to have all those knock-on effects into their economic impact of the region. So I think if we work with me from the grassroots up and have those dialogues across the sector, then I think that's where it's a good place to spend energy.
Right, and again, that energy is something that we're continue to want to show on this issue. We do it kind of across the different work that CAPI does. Land use continues to come up, and we'll continue to focus on it. So thank you to our three panelists today. I'd like you to also like to thank Matt and his team for developing the tool. Please go to CAPI's new land use hub, where you can dive into the tool, explore what it can do, and and learn from what we know about the different way land is being used and how that's changing, and also into some of the forecast tools that are there. We have a workshop that's coming up where you can get some additional guidance and support around how to use that tool. The invitation to it was put into the chat. Space is limited, so please feel free to register. Really am also want to acknowledge our grateful recognition of the support from the RBC Tech for Nature Fund for this particular web mapping tool and our broader environmental initiative spearheading sustainable solutions. Appreciate everyone joining us today, and please stay tuned, sign up for the CAPI email address so you can follow all of the other great things that we're doing. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.
Take care.